It has been an eventful few days for the Democratic Party, from the contested Nevada State Democratic Convention Saturday to the split results Tuesday night in primaries in both Kentucky and Oregon. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton declared victory against Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders in the primary on Tuesday in Kentucky, though it is razor-thin margin, while Sanders won a decisive victory in Oregon. Last night, Sanders spoke to about 12,000 supporters in Carson, California, directly addressing the Democratic Party leadership.
In almost every case, whether it is a national poll or a state poll, we do much better against Trump than does Secretary Clinton. A poll just came out, I think it was yesterday, in the state of Georgia, not a very good state for us. Trump was beating Secretary Clinton by 4 points. We were beating him by 5 points. If the Democratic Party wants to be certain that Donald Trump is defeated, and that we must do, we together are the campaign to do that.
The relationship between the Sanders campaign and the Democratic Party leadership has been challenging from the start of the primary race, when former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton began with a more than 400 delegate lead by securing support from superdelegates, the 712 congressmen, senators, governors, and other elected officials who often represent the Democratic Party elite. Well, a new article from In These Times by Branko Marcetic uncovers the secret history of superdelegates, which were established by the Hunt Commission in 1982. Jessica Stites is executive editor of In These Times and editor of the site's June cover story. Still with us, Rick Perlstein, Chicago-based reporter and author of several books, including Nixonland, The Rise of a President and the Fracturing of America. Let's start with you, Jessica. Explain the superdelegates, which has really become such a critical issue right now, how they came into being.
Sure. Yeah, our reporter, Branko Marcetic, actually went down to the National Archives and dug up the transcripts of this entire commission that debated for months about Democratic Party rules reforms and came up with the superdelegates as their answer. And basically what had prompted this were the losses of Carter and McGovern, and so this fear that the Democratic Party wasn't nominating sort of electable, winnable candidates. And so these sort of party insiders sat down and said, what do we do? And their instinct was, well, we need to take control. We need to take control of the nominating process. We're worried that sort of if we let the people decide through primaries, they're going to pick the wrong person. And so they instituted the superdelegate, who could act as a corrective, essentially, to the popular vote by, at the convention, casting votes for whomever they chose. And what really the sort of psychology you saw there, and this comes up a lot in the transcripts, is this fear of the activist or the outsider candidate that might disrupt the party, might not work with the Democrats the way they want once that person comes to the presidency. And this sort of sense that the elites kind of know best, and we have a particular political acumen.
And again, this was in response to...
Well, McGovern and Carter. So interestingly, they didn't see Carter as an insider in any way. They saw him as this sort of Southern outsider who was mostly drawing officials from his own local circles, and he wasn't working with them in the ways they wanted him to when he was in office. So they were afraid of someone like that, and then they were afraid of a leftist activist, a grassroots activist. So those were their two fears. And they also, they were reacting in large part to the spread of the primary system, which had really become much more central after some 1968 reforms that were put into place.
I want to turn to a quote from Geraldine Ferraro, member of Congress from New York, first female vice presidential candidate, who was a member of the Hunt Commission. She said during a meeting of the commission in November 1981, quote, "No one knows those people better than a member of Congress. No one is better able to represent them at the convention than a member of Congress, and no one is better able to get them to support a candidate if they really try." Explain, Jessica.
Yes. So that was the sort of tortured logic you kept seeing at the commission, where they said kind of the people who vote in primaries can't represent the grassroots as well as Congress members can, because Congress members were originally elected. So sort of this layer of representation is somehow going to help represent the grassroots instead of letting people just vote for themselves. And it's very odd.
Interestingly, I mean, Congress members aren't elected by superdelegates.
An excellent point. And at the time, to be fair, the primary turnout was fairly low, and it's still lower than a presidential election today. So that was their logic as well. We maybe got more votes than the primary.
Let me turn to a quote from Cleetta Dietrich, one of the members of the Hunt Commission as well. She expressed concern about the division that a system of superdelegates might create, saying, quote, "You raise the question of creating different castes of delegates potentially. Delegates, which are chosen essentially by voters' decisions for candidates in primaries or caucuses, and a different caste of delegates who, in fact, are exempt from that process and, in fact, carry on their own by a different set of standards." It gets you into a question of how those processes relate, and it gets to an essential question of legitimacy.
Yeah, she was really prescient, because that is exactly the criticism of superdelegates today. And it's they're very unpopular, and there really is a movement rising up to say, why should the Democratic Party have this sort of final deciding vote instead of listening to the will of the people?
So talk about superdelegates in relation now to Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton.
Sure. Well, what's so interesting, and we're seeing this especially after the results this morning, is that neither of them are on track to a decisive victory based only on primaries and caucuses. So they would need to get 2,383 pledged delegates coming out of that process in order to just be the nominee. And that means superdelegates will matter at the convention. They will be the ones who ultimately tip someone over the edge. And what we're seeing from Sanders is this kind of fascinating pivot. So he was initially very much against superdelegates because they had given Hillary Clinton this incredible momentum starting out in the race, which I think is the main criticism of superdelegates, is they give someone a sort of unfair advantage by making it look like they're already ahead before the race begins. But now Sanders is saying, well, you've got this class of people who are supposed to be making sure the Democratic Party has a winning candidate. That's their reason for being. And that was very much what we saw in the transcripts was, if something should happen midstream and the candidate that is the front runner in the primaries and caucuses looks like they can't win, maybe they have a scandal, we want to be able to correct that. And so Sanders is saying, well, something unexpected happened. Donald Trump is the nominee of the Republican Party. The Democrats need to react to that, and I am polling better than Hillary Clinton against Donald Trump in some key states. He was talking about, I think, Georgia in that clip, but that's happening in Ohio, which is a really important, obviously, state. And so that's his case to the superdelegates is, well, if you have this weird system where you can trump the popular vote, isn't this the time to use it?
And the move to reform the superdelegate system, do you see this all changing?
That's a great question right now. So Sanders is no longer talking about that because he's trying to court the superdelegates. But I don't think it's off the table at all. We had an op-ed actually run along with our cover story by Larry Cohen, who is the former president of the Communication Workers of America, but also a senior advisor to the Sanders campaign. And he is calling very strongly for at the convention for the Democrats to abolish or reform the superdelegate system. And I think there's definitely a faction within the Sanders campaign that wants that.
Can you talk, Rick Perlstein, about how the Democrats and their process compares to the Republicans?
They're similar. When the Democrats reformed their system, between 1968 and 1972, it was kind of seen as this was the direction history was going. More democracy, less smoke-filled rooms. So a system in both parties that had been kind of mostly caucuses and conventions, and some primaries became mostly primaries, and then some caucuses and conventions.
What happened in Nevada? Can you, Jessica Stites, talk about what we just saw? I mean, there's a police line in front of the stage.
Yeah, I think that.
And Rick, would you like to weigh in on that?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we saw the footage. It was a very contested convention. The Clinton folks say the Sanders folks knew the rules in advance and then complained when the rules didn't advantage them. The Sanders folks say that basically we have an establishment that's trying to assert their powers. I think when I look back historically, I see the attempts to exacerbate these divisions as possibly a strategy of Donald Trump and the Republicans. He has an ally named Roger Stone, who was part of Watergate. The whole strategy of Watergate, all through 1972, was to create divisions that were based in real divisions, but to exacerbate them. So like a Roger Stone type figure would steal letterhead from one of the Democratic candidates, write a letter accusing another Democratic candidate of cheating, and then get that out to the media, right? So the idea is if Democrats can't get back together in the general election, then the Democrats can't win. Now, these divisions are real, and the anger is real, but the exploitation of it is very similar to kind of what the FBI did in COINTELPRO. They take real divisions and try and turn them into divisions that make it possible for people to work together. So we need to be careful about that.
Roger Stone is a source on so many of the National Enquirer stories against.
That's right. My next article is about how
Ted Cruz.
Yeah, Donald Trump partakes of a reactionary tradition within gossip politics, something like the National Enquirer. I actually have a document in which Michael Deaver, Ronald Reagan's longtime aide, tries to pitch Ronald Reagan as a columnist for the National Enquirer in 1975. So there's a continuity there.
Back to Hunt Commission. Your final observations, Jessica Stites, as you dug into the documents and your reporter did. It was named after...
Oh, Hunt, he was a former governor, I think, and he was chairing the... No, is that wrong, Rick? You're making history faces.
No, I
believe so.
South Carolina,
so that sounds right.
But that was kind of it. He was a Southerner, right?
Yes. He was chairing the commission. I think superdelegates are not the only thing wrong with our electoral process. And one of the great things about kind of opening the door to questioning superdelegates, which are a pretty easy reform for the Democratic Party to make if they so choose, is what else is wrong? Why are so few Americans voting in our general elections?
Less than 80%. No. More than 80% of people are not voting in the primaries and caucuses.
Yeah, and that is a real problem. And there are things that can be done to address that. I mean, Rob Ritchie of Fair Vote has, I think, a great proposal, which is have one nationwide primary on one day, one person, one vote, and that'll decide the Democratic candidate. So there are things we can do, and this is just a party process. This does not require changing the Constitution.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us. Jessica Stites of In These Times, which is based here in Chicago, and Rick Perlstein, a Chicago-based reporter who reports for The Washington Spectator. And we're going to link to all your reports at democracynow.org. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. When we